Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., and also editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And it's a great pleasure today to talk with two of the three authors of a new book, a primer on Christian political engagement called Compassion and Conviction. The two authors whom I'm speaking with are Justin Giboney in Atlanta, Georgia, and Michael Wear here in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. So thank you both for joining this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Since you can describe yourselves better than I can, if you could briefly just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to write a book on Christian political engagement.
Sure, I guess I can go first. I'm Justin Giboney. I am an attorney, political strategist, and the co-founder of the AND campaign. I have worked in doing political strategy in the city of Atlanta and the state of Georgia for, over a decade. And so in doing so, I just kind of noticed that first in kind of within my progressive space, I just kind of noticed that Christians who entered politics in a serious way felt like they had to surrender some of their convictions. But then I also had friends who were on the more conservative or Republican side of the conversation that felt that they had to surrender some of their compassion or compromise their compassion. And so that's kind of where I started thinking about how Christians could do politics more faithfully. And that's how I really got into the space.
And Michael?
Yeah, so I'm Michael Wear. I'm chief strategist with the AND campaign, and we'll hit 2 years with the AND campaign tomorrow. I spent a lot of time in politics and government, worked in the White House and presidential campaigns, and joined the AND campaign because I was excited about Justin's vision, excited about the opportunity to build and be a part of a 21st century Christian civic organization that applied lessons that I think we've learned over the last certainly 40, 50 years, and tried to build an effective, faithful organization and community for 21st century challenges. And it's just been a great pleasure to do that. And the book, I think, is a very concrete expression of that vision.
And the book, of course, is if I understand correctly, is a project of the AND campaign. The AND campaign is basically a project to promote positive political and social engagement.
Yeah, well, it's a Christian civic engagement that's trying to get Christians to reassert the compassion and conviction of the gospel into politics. Sometimes that's very positive. It definitely needs to be civil, but sometimes it's tough, right? Sometimes it's speaking the truth, which isn't always pretty. But I think we try to combine that love and truth, compassion and conviction. And that's really what the AND campaign is about. We want to be less about partisanship and ideology and more about the Bible and those core principles.
So your book is partly an attempt to distill basic Christian principles that should unite all people of faith in terms of how they pursue the public good, the common good. Some of your points seem or should seem obvious, but unfortunately the obvious needs pointing out these days, even to fairly literate Christians. But if you had to summarize the top 4 or 5 basic premises of your book, what would they be? Why did God create government, and how should Christians engage with it?
Maybe I'll cover 2 and then Michael can cover 2. I think we would start by saying that Christians should be involved in civic engagement, that we are commanded to love our neighbor like ourselves. And we believe that politics presents us with a robust opportunity to love our neighbors. By doing justice and promoting human flourishing and defending human dignity, we are loving our neighbors. Now, that's not more important than proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. But I think within that gospel, it compels us to love our neighbors and to go out there and show that our faith is not dead. So the first thing I would say is that, number one, we should be engaged because it gives us a chance to help those around us and love our neighbors with action. Number 2, I would say we talk a lot about compassion and conviction, that social justice and moral order are not mutually exclusive, right? Our political landscape kind of separates the two, as if, if you have to go to the left if you're about social justice, you have to go to the right if you're about more order. But we see the gospel as being both, and we think that both of those are kind of out of whack if the other isn't coupled with it. And so those are the first two that I would point out.
Yeah, I'd say we also, we're really clear about sort of where we stand. The book is very practical, very application heavy. This is a resource that we think is ideal for church small groups and the boards of nonprofits to walk through, and elders and vestries of churches. But for all of the practical sort of side of the book, I think what we're also clear on is that as important politics is, it's not ultimate. And that there are sort of tools in the toolbox of political engagement that Christians just should not be picking up, that Christians should not be utilizing, that the prudential nature of politics, the ultimate reality of the kingdom of God, means that we're going to engage in politics in a different way, that sort of zero sum or tactics of compromise, tactics of manipulation are just not going to be in the Christian's repertoire. So I think that's a key aspect of this. And then, there are several chapters in the book, whether it's about dealing with partnerships and helping Christians think through, well, how do I think about operating in a political system that's pluralistic, and where I agree with some people and some politicians, some organizations on some issues, but not on others. How do I think about working with others while remaining faithful? And then when you think about processing sort of political rhetoric, the book really offers a way of thinking about faithfulness in politics that isn't prescriptive to the extent of this is the position you have to have on the capital gains tax, but it's how do we make sure that we're thinking Christianly about policies and political questions, even if we end up in different places.
Now, as you know, and your book addresses this somewhat, the common narrative that seriously religious people in America are Republican, and the Democratic Party is the secular party. Obviously, polls and statistics show that's a very incomplete truth. But in your book, you do acknowledge that if you're in progressive politics, yet if you're theologically orthodox and have traditional views on sanctity of life or on marriage, you will face some unique challenges. So how do you all navigate those challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as you said, it's pretty much ahistorical to say that traditional Christians couldn't be in the Democratic Party. The Black traditional church has done it for years. But the way we avoid some of those pitfalls and some of what we've called religious exclusion that's going on in the Democratic Party is not making the party part of our identity and challenging the party, right? Seeing those places where they're being illiberal or not holding up to what we have seen historically as the party's values, calling folks out on it. But for us, a party really is a tool. It's not part of our identity. And so, if we think of it as a tool, then it really isn't as hard as people think to use it to your advantage, to really do God's will, to be faithful in the civic arena. And I think that's one big part of it, separating it from our identity and challenging our party, being critical of our party because it's not part of our identity anyway.
Yeah, I'd also say, I think we're in a moment now where Christians who are in the Republican Party increasingly feel some kind of distance, ideological, emotional, moral distance, and a desire to, among many, to remain Republican while also being able to critique their party. So I think that there's a growing shared sense across the political spectrum that this system where political parties sort of present themselves as a brand, as an identity or a cause you have to buy into totally, works great for political parties, doesn't work great for the American people, doesn't work great for individual Americans. And so I think we're tapping into some of that sentiment and offering people a better way to think about things.
Your book also offers a critique or a warning against so-called cancel culture. And I guess it should be an obvious point that Christians believing everyone bears the image of God. We should esteem free speech and open debate and honor even the right of people to be wrong. But you articulated in your own ways, I thought, fairly well in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to that briefly, which is just to say, I think that there's a lot of conflation that happens in these kinds of debates. I think we believe there should be accountability in public rhetoric, especially for public figures. We think that, again, especially those in public leadership have responsibility for what they say. We also think that there's a vindictiveness, a lack of, and even the opportunity for forgiveness in our public culture right now that is not suppressed, but actually fanned, and that's something that we think Christians, especially, not to mention the rest of society, need to think very carefully about. Yes, there ought to be guardrails on conversations that we have. People have to be accountable for what they say, but this sort of mobilization of what we call a mob mentality that kind of gets rid of reason and sort of takes a lot of esteem out of just being able to dominate people in the public square beyond reason is not helpful. It's not helpful to society, and it's not, as you said, it doesn't regard the dignity of the human person as we should.
I appreciate that you all mentioned Francis Schaeffer in your book. People under the age of 50 or even 40 tend not to remember who he was. But if you were my age, when you were in your early 20s, you read C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer. But you note that he advocated a sense of co-belligerency between Christians and non-Christians on causes of common concern. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I think the point we were making there is that when it comes to working with others, non-believers, we need to understand the opportunities that are there, because I think historically and even biblically, there are chances because of common grace to do good things with people outside of the faith. That is, we've seen that over and over. But we also need to understand the limits. And we wanted to make sure that people understood the limits when it came to partnerships in the civic arena, but also with partisanship. Where do we draw the line? Are we clear on the fact that our objective and their objective at some point are going to diverge? And where exactly does that diverge? And making sure that we go into those relationships with that understanding, but most importantly, with an understanding of who we are. So we're not sucked into things that are just unbiblical.
Now, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your book, but if you're a Protestant or an evangelical, obviously you don't have the Catholic Church's magisterium or its tradition of a particular social teaching. And in America today, denominations count for less and less and less, which is kind of isolating and often leaves Protestants and evangelicals thinking they have to think it all up by themselves or draw straight lines from Bible verses to particular policy positions. You all, as you think politically, and you offer some basic Christian principles about government and politics, but to whom do you look for counsel on these issues? What great thinkers and writers in history and or people currently who have been helpful to you?
Yeah, if I can go ahead.
So there's a real range. I mean, I think I'd first just affirm your statement that I think there's been a disregard for or a sort of not enough regard for Christian tradition, for the value of institutions and institutional thinking that happens over time, and drawing from the tradition. And so just generally I'd affirm that. I think I look to a range of leaders. The civil rights movement is very important to me. Going a bit earlier to Thurman has been an influence, especially, we reference Thurman quite a bit near the end of the book, and how to think about how you regard the human person in public. Dallas Willard is a major influence to me. I think of, everyone from Niebuhr to Schaeffer to C.S. Lewis to Jacques Ellul. I think a pretty wide span of Christian thinkers. And then I look to institutions, I think your center provides some helpful insight. Center for Public Justice is an excellent institution. There are acting institutions, I'd include the AND campaign among them, that are doing this work in an institutional way, and that we look to.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Michael said, and just coming out of the Black church tradition, just a lot of civil rights activists or civil rights legends. And so one of the folks that I don't think gets enough attention would be someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who I think had a very clear civic. I'm sorry, guys. 1 second. Go, guys, go. Who I think had a very clear just civic ethic and how she went about certain things. I would add, you talk about Catholicism, I'd add Dorothy Day. I think Dorothy Day is someone who was very clear. And they really match what the AND campaign is doing, because they had this compassion and conviction. I don't think they were captured by any ideology or fit perfectly within those ideologies. And so those have been very helpful for me.
So everybody talks about polarization in America, and there was a time not long ago when the mainline Protestant churches were paramount, and those denominations had Republicans and Democrats in them, and were able to mediate some of these differences. With their decline, the church itself is so much more politically segregated and polarized, and perhaps contributing to national polarization. How can Christians work against this polarization to find common causes among us?
I think the main thing would be to find common ground, to do what we can to make sure that we're accentuating or emphasizing the common ground that we have as Americans, but also that we have as Christians. There's a critical mass of Christians on both sides of the political spectrum, and we need to come together and say, hey, this is where we can work together to make things better on things like criminal justice and so on.
Justin, do you want to introduce your visitor there?
My visitor is my son, Crew.
Hey,
he is 1, and he is active right now. So.
Excellent. Well, hopefully he likes your book.
Absolutely.
And Michael, how can the church and how can Christians individually resist chronic polarization?
Yeah, I think at the base level, it's a question of discipleship. I think discipleship is at the core of so many of the problems and criticisms that people have of the church. You go down to the root, and it's that people aren't formed in the likeness of Christ, and that ought to be the orientation and the aim of Christians in all things. And so, I think there are institutional responses to that. I do think that Christian institutions, including the local church, needs to think more about not just expecting people to apply general principles to public life on their own, but actually, again, this isn't about advising on policy positions. It's what kind of people does God call us to be in public, in the same way that we think about how God calls us to be in our marriage or our personal finances or local relationships. We need to start being a lot more explicit about what the public posture of a Christian ought to be, especially in an increasingly pluralistic context.
Michael, you don't have a copy of your book within reach, do you?
Yes, I do.
Hey, just hold it up for a moment. There we go. Yeah. Compassion and conviction. Well, a final question for both of you. As Christians, obviously, you're people of hope, and your book generally is upbeat. But to be upbeat today is to be out of fashion. We're in a cultural moment of despair and negativity. So besides our hope in the gospel, of course, what signs of hope do you find within American Christianity and even American culture right now that would give you cause for being not just hopeful in a spiritual sense, but also optimistic in a temporal sense?
Yeah, I'd say I am generally encouraged by the rise in civic participation that we've seen. I think that energy could be misdirected in sort of negative ways, but I'm encouraged and excited that you have folks, especially young people, increasingly seeing sort of the civic space as a place where they have a role, where their voice matters, where they have their hand on the wheel of this nation and on their futures. And I think an aspect of what we're trying to do with the AND campaign, what's a larger civic project, of course, is just making sure that that the increase in civic participation is reciprocated with a strengthening of democracy, a strengthening of civic processes, so that folks do feel like there's promise and potential in engaging in politics and civic life in a healthy way.
Yeah, I would just briefly say, I'm sorry. I would just briefly say that I'm encouraged by the focus on the question of race and America's history when it comes to race. I think it's very important that we address that issue, and it seems to be coming into the conversation in a better way.
And I have to ask you, Justin, at least briefly, although it's a complex topic, who is addressing race really well right now in American Christianity, institutionally or personally? I know that's a big question.
You said who is addressing it really well?
Yeah, are there any particular thinkers or writers or groups that come to mind who really are, from a Christian perspective, addressing issues of race that you would commend?
There's a new...
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to that. You know, I think we're Lisa Fields at Jude 3 is a partner of ours, and we think she's been doing excellent work engaging some of these topics. I'd say Esau McCauley, who is now a New York Times contributing writer, is a wonderful voice. You know,
teaching at Wheaton.
That's right, teaching at Wheaton. The Asian American Christian Collaborative is a new effort that we've been happy to support in the past. And so there are really a range of voices. I've been encouraged to see, even, you know, when you look to new voices being lifted up like Esau, look at New York Times bestseller list, and to see Christians are being looked to speak into this moment. I think that's an encouraging thing. You know, I'd say Walter Kim at the National Association of Evangelicals is someone who's been a helpful voice. And so, yeah, I've actually been encouraged. We got a lot of we got a long road to go. There's a lot of work to be done, but I do think this is a moment for Christian leadership. This is not something that Christians can or should shrink back from.
Maybe that will be your all's next book.
Yeah, maybe, absolutely.
All right, Justin Giboney and Michael Weir, two of the three authors of Compassion and Conviction. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
So much.